mind complex. The mind is a complex which reflects the inpourings of the spirit and the uppourings of the body complex. The heart of the mind complex is that dynamic entity which absorbs, seeks, and attempts to learn. Within the mind lies an hierarchical construction likened unto geography and, in some ways, geometry, for the hierarchy is quite regular, bearing inner relationships and ratios. Using Ra's metaphor of the mind as a tree, the more conscious upper portions of the mind contain feelings, emotions, and intellectual or rational thought forms. Moving down the tree of the mind, we see the intuition occupying the trunk as it makes contact with the roots of the self's total beingness. Moving into the roots of mind, we find the progression of consciousness, which turns gradually from the individual unconscious to the racial mind, the planetary mind, the archetypical mind, and then to the cosmic all mind. From those aforementioned roots, the mind becomes a direct contactor of the spirit complex shuttle. In conjunction with the body complex, particularly the brain, the mind complex fulfills the requisite for experience of third density, self-awareness, or self-consciousness. In order to fulfill this necessity, the mind-body complex must be capable of abstract thought, which is achieved by the combination of the rational and intuitive minds. Of the mind, body, and spirit, the mind is the first that must know itself, the first that must be initiated, and it is that complex which tends to be the most often distorted of the three. Firstly, the mind must be known to itself. This is perhaps the most demanding part of healing work. If the mind knows itself, then the most important aspect of healing has occurred, for consciousness is the microcosm of the law of one. Part of the work of the mind knowing itself is a process of discovering the completeness within the mind, for it, as Ra says, contains all things. To begin to master the concept of mental discipline, it is necessary to examine the self. The polarity of your dimension must be internalized. Where you find patience within your mind, you must consciously find the corresponding impatience and vice versa. Each thought that a being has in its turn an antithesis. The disciplines of the mind involve, first of all, identifying both those things of which you approve and those things of which you disapprove within yourself, and then balancing each and every positive and negative charge with its equal. The mind contains all things, therefore you must discover this completeness within yourself. Much of the mind's activity of which we are aware during the incarnation is, like the chemical body complex, a surface illusion that falls away upon death. The deeper mind contains the character or pure distillation of emotions, biases, and wisdoms, which tend to be either ignored or underestimated during the lifetime. Here we find the true identity of the mind. The unconscious, personal to group to cosmic. With the advent of the veil, the deeper portion of the mind was shrouded from the upper portion, thus rendering the former unconscious, as we call it, and the later conscious. Thus the mind became a mind complex. How conscious the entity is of the material and experience of its conscious mind is uncertain. Much can transpire in the domain of the conscious mind, from thoughts to feelings to initiative impulses that don't gain the self full attention. I think that anything arising that is potentially noticeable to the waking attention circumscribes the basic scope of the conscious mind, though that which we notice tends to be only the tip of a large or very large iceberg. Naturally, the more present we are, the more we engage in mindfulness, the more aware we are of the content and movements of our ever activity, incessantly talkative minds. But what about that which, no matter how much mindfulness we practice, remains generally outside of the awareness of the conscious mind, into what Ra calls a great sea, a storehouse, and a vast realm of potential? One looks the unconscious mind. The unconscious may shuttle information or desire upward through the veil to reach the attention of the conscious mind. Indeed, most catalyst arises from or is a communication of the unconscious mind. Or, conversely, the conscious mind may move downward to penetrate the veil and access a specific coordinate or thread of information in the unconscious mind, such as through regressive hypnosis. But the unconscious mind is by definition partitioned from the conscious mind by the veil. It is thus made relatively more mystery-filled, obscured to the knowledge and the reach of the conscious mind. To frame this another way, if your mind were, say, a tree, aware mostly of only the part of you that is above ground, the unconscious would be your hidden roots below ground. Roots that run so deep that they reach and become part of a collective root system, eventually reaching infinite consciousness. The unconscious or subconscious, or maybe you could say non-conscious mind, includes those layers previously mentioned in this entry. The nearest to the individual's conscious mind at the trunk, the first roots beyond the veil, is the individual's personal subconscious. This contains all the forgotten, repressed, or unnoticed experience of the conscious mind, along with all the deeper emotions, distilled experience, and biases of the self. The biographical record contained in this layer extends beyond the current lifetime to include the pre-incarnational programming and all the previous incarnations of the individual mind-body-spirit complex as well. Moving downward and away from individual consciousness, the mind begins to merge with other minds into a shared or group mind. The first of which is the racial mind, containing the memory and experiences of that particular race. Moving further downward into the roots of the unconscious mind, the container of mind widens even larger to include the planetary mind, that is, the mind of all the third density entities who call that particular planet home, and in some ways overlaps with or contains the mind of Gaia herself. This is also called the Akashic Records or Akashic Mind. Like the racial mind, it is a shared or collective repository which contains all the experiences, memories, and information of every third density being on the planet. A planetary mind and racial mind could potentially be one and the same if all entities of that planet were of one race. Our particular planet, however, includes various races. The sources of the racial minds are ambiguous, but it seems that most of the racial minds on this planet are of populations from different planets who, incarnating here, have retained their own racial mind. Each racial mind then contributes to and is a subset of the larger planetary mind. What constitutes race in terms of populations on Earth as we know them is also not entirely clear. A racial mind can probably constitute any group mind that is smaller than planetary. But how does a group mind form? I would imagine it has to do with shared values and worldview. Those would be most likely to constellate and congeal in shared culture, which has historically been circumscribed by geography in some way. But with colonization and globalization, shared group minds could now be occupying many physically disparate locations. Either way, the racial mind is not necessarily one and the same as pigmentation or other genetically determined differences in physical features. We suggest that in looking at planetary origins, one observes not the pigmentation of integument skin color, but the biases concerning interactions with other selves and definitions regarding the nature of the self. Ra indicates that the great diversity of racial minds on this planet hailing from different locations is both unusual, statistically speaking, and contributes to the difficulty unifying the planetary mind into one orientation. It is somewhat unusual for a planetary mind-body-spirit complex to contain those from many various loci. But this explains much, for you see, you are experiencing the third dimensional occurrence with a large number of those who must repeat the cycle. The orientation, thus, has been difficult to unify even with the aid of many of your teach learners. However, the racial mind is formed tribe, nation, ethnicity, locality. It seems that these groupings are an inevitable part of the third density experience. Questioner: then there is an extreme variation in the form of the physical vehicle in third density in the universe. I assume this is also true of fourth density. Is this correct? I am Ra. This is so. We remind you that it is a great theoretical distance between demanding that the creatures of an infinite creation be unnoticeably similar to oneself, and observing those signs which may be called human, which denote the third density characteristics of self-consciousness, the grouping into pairs, societal groups, and races, and the further characteristic means of using self-consciousness to refine and search for the meaning of milieu. Moving deeper into the next strata, the roots of the unconscious mind, we come to the mind of the sub-logos, the mind of our sun, the archetypical mind. This deeply unconscious portion of the mind complex is not, Ra says, a function of altering memory, meaning that it is not modified or added to by the memory of lived experience. By contrast, Ra describes how a particular bias has filtered down into and contaminated the racial mind, thus potentially affecting or informing all entities who shared that mind. In the racial memory, there is some, shall we say, contamination even of the sexual. This showing mostly in your own culture as the various predispositions to adversary relationships, or as you call them, marriages, rather than the free giving of one to another in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. Being unaffected by altering memory, the archetypical mind is instead a pure, undistorted architecture of the third density mind, a blueprint that contains all facets which may affect mind or experience. Every entity who moves through third density on any planet within the sphere of a particular sublogos shares the same archetypical mind. This means that humans on Earth share the same archetypical mind as those of Ra. As Ra evolved within our own solar system under the same sublogos, this archetypical mind is a refinement made by the local sublogos of the next and final layer or container of the roots of the mind. The cosmic mind, or all mind, is what might be termed the mind of the Creator. Ra does not speak definitely to this final, bottommost layer in the roots of mind. It can be inferred that every being possessed of a mind complex in the entire universe, octave, or creation shares this mind. The cosmic mind would pattern the mind of all third density beings in its own architecture, subsequently refined into an archetypal mind by each sublogos. And it would presumably contain record of every lived memory and experience of all beings in creation.